Most people are rather convinced that what they see is what there is, and that opinions drawn from daily experience are more or less reliable. In the quiet of the evening, as shadows lengthen on the walls, it rarely occurs to anyone that those shadows might be all there is, at least according to some thinkers. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is. It is always interesting to see who is joining us from around the world. Now then, let us ease into tonight's journey together. Tonight, the philosopher in question is Plato, working in 4th century BCE, Athens, a city-state that produced more arguments than olive oil, and was home to his academy, one of history's first proper educational institutions. Plato was not content to trust what could be seen or touched. He preferred to imagine a world of pure forms, accessible only to the mind, and regarded those who disagreed as kindly misguided, if not hopelessly blinkered. The allegory of the cave, nestled within his dialogue, The Republic, is not so much an allegory as a gentle accusation. Plato implies that nearly everyone is chained up in ignorance, staring at shadows projected on a cave wall, mistaking them for reality. Philosophers, inconveniently, are those rare souls who break free, stagger into the blinding sunlight, and then attempt to explain to everyone else that the world is not what they thought. The real surprise is that he managed to keep students enrolled at all. One contradiction quickly emerges. Plato insists on the importance of pursuing truth, while arguing that almost no one is fit to perceive it. Yet, he writes dialogues, public debates on open scrolls, inviting anyone to follow his argument. The invitation is nearly universal, but the outcome is inevitably exclusive. In Athens, philosophy was considered a public pursuit, but its rewards were privately held. One can only admire the confidence. Consider the everyday setting of Plato's academy. A grove just outside Athens, shaded by olive trees, and oddly impervious to comfortable seating arrangements. Students gathered on stone benches, scrolls in hand, straining to follow labyrinthine arguments about reality and illusion. Between debates, they might take lunch, likely olives, bread and wine, while discussing whether lunch itself was more real than the idea of lunch. In this world, the mundane becomes absurdly theoretical, and the theoretical is rarely straightforward. The allegory itself remains a fixture of philosophical thought, not because it solves any mysteries, but because it raises better questions. Is knowledge ever more than a flickering shadow? Can anyone truly escape ignorance, or does each new insight only reveal another set of chains? The cave has become a convenient shorthand for the human condition, one that philosophers have been eager to complicate for over 2,000 years. As the lamps are lit and the city quiets, the question lingers: what exactly is real, and who is qualified to decide? It is time to step into Plato's cave, notice the flicker of torchlight on ancient stone, and listen to the shifting debates that have never quite ended. In the 4th century BCE, Athens presented itself as a city both restless and ambitious, its marble columns catching the sun and its public squares humming with voices. Philosophers were a familiar sight along the shady walks of the Agora, blending into the background noise of civic life, not quite as necessary as bakers or stonemasons, but noticeably more persistent in their discussions. The city was small by later standards, yet it had an outsized intellectual appetite. Its citizens believed that public debate was not merely a pastime, but a civic duty, which is rather helpful if one has more opinions than coins. Within this setting, Plato made his presence felt. Born into a wealthy family, accustomed to the rituals of Athenian dining and the demands of civic religion, he nevertheless devoted himself to the life of the mind. His academy, founded around 387 BCE, stood just outside the city walls in a grove that had previously served as a gymnasium. It became the prototype for later philosophical schools, though its benches were harder than necessary and its curriculum less practical than most parents would have preferred. In the academy, learning was not rushed. Students and masters argued for hours at a time, their robes gathering the dust of olive trees, the slow scratching of reed pens on papyrus, a constant undertone. Plato's intellectual context was one of transition and tension. The political power of Athens had diminished after the Peloponnesian War, and democracy, though celebrated, was widely doubted by those who noticed it had condemned Socrates to death only a generation earlier. Religious festivals marked the city's calendar, statues of gods watched over the markets, and yet skepticism about traditional beliefs was quietly on the rise among the literate class. Philosophers, it seemed, had a talent for dissecting the very stories that once gave order to life, with the happy result that few agreed on anything for long. Plato positioned himself as a critic of Athenian common sense, which he regarded as a parade of errors. He rejected the idea that knowledge could arise merely from sense experience, arguing instead for a realm of unchanging forms, true realities, behind the everyday world. This theory, though famously difficult to describe, had an enduring appeal for anyone dissatisfied with the messiness of daily life. Nevertheless, Plato's commitment to abstract truth did little to simplify the conduct of his students, who still needed directions to the latrine and reminders to return borrowed scrolls. The academy operated on a rhythm distinct from the city's markets or military drills. Mornings might open with public readings of dialogues, Plato's preferred method for philosophical exposition. These dialogues were not casual conversations, but careful arguments in which each participant served as a stand-in for a particular point of view. Students listened while seated on worn benches or reclined in the shade, sometimes feigning comprehension until a more confident peer voiced confusion. After the readings, small groups would disperse to debate, with some wandering the grove, others gathering around low tables where sand could be used to diagram an argument. Lunch, when it arrived, was sparse but sufficient: simple bread, olives, and perhaps a diluted cup of wine. Even the meals served as fodder for philosophical reflection, as students performed the uniquely academic feat of arguing about the precise meaning of appetite while refusing to share the last fig. Writing in this context was a material process. Papyrus scrolls, imported at considerable expense, were closely guarded. Copyists labored over texts, their hands stained by ink, and their patience tested by the endless repetition of arguments about virtue, courage, or the nature of reality. Errors crept in with the regularity of the seasons, and each copy was likely to carry a different interpretation of a key passage. Plato's own manuscripts, circulated among trusted students, were read aloud in the evenings, their ideas drifting into the smoke from oil lamps suspended overhead. The materiality of philosophy was never far from mind. Knowledge was as fragile as a papyrus scroll and nearly as flammable. Broader Athenian society observed these activities with a mix of suspicion and distant respect. Philosophers were occasionally summoned to advise statesmen, though their advice was rarely taken without revision. The academy survived by cultivating patrons among the wealthy, and by maintaining a careful balance between intellectual radicalism and public decorum. Plato's personal reputation was bolstered by his association with Socrates, though he avoided Socrates' fate by the simple expedient of writing dialogues instead of publicly cross-examining city officials. For all its talk of universal forms, the academy was as much a product of Athenian social structures as the law courts or the theatre. In this context, the allegory of the cave took shape, a story about captives mistaking shadows for reality, presented in a city where theatrical illusion and political rhetoric were daily fare. It was an argument dressed in narrative, designed to unsettle the comfortable assumption that knowledge is easy or common. The cave, in Plato's telling, was not only a metaphor, but a recognizable feature of the intellectual landscape, furnishing Athens with one more reminder that most people see only what they are prepared to see, and that philosophers, however earnest, are often met with polite bewilderment. The academy's benches remained unpadded, the arguments unending, and the search for insight as slow as the grinding of olive stones at the city's edge. Within the walls of Plato's academy, the business of philosophy unfolded at an unhurried pace, insulated from the urgency of the agora or the rivalries of Athenian politics. The day's routine revolved around the practices of inquiry and argument, a deliberate cultivation of the mind that unfolded through slow discussion, careful reading, and the persistent copying of texts. The architecture of the academy itself was functional rather than grand, with simple colonnades marking walkways between shaded courtyards and lecture areas. Olive trees offered intermittent shade, their leaves filtering light onto clusters of students gathered around their teachers. The cool stone of the benches, unaccommodating to lengthy comfort, encouraged regular movement between sessions. The structure of learning was communal, yet hierarchical. Plato presided over discussions, his authority rarely challenged except by the most emboldened students, for whom disagreement was more sport than rebellion. Dialogues were read aloud, with each voice assuming the role of a character in Plato's dramatic conversations. The Republic, the text in which the Allegory of the Cave appears, was a favorite for such readings. Passages concerning justice, education, and the nature of truth were debated endlessly. However, real consensus remained as elusive as ever. Every answer seemed to produce 3 new questions, a pattern that provided lasting employment for the faculty. Copying manuscripts was a daily necessity. Papyrus was expensive and sometimes scarce, so every scroll was guarded as if it were a minor treasure. Students took turns copying Plato's dialogues by hand, their efforts overseen by more experienced scholars who corrected errors with the slight resignation of those who know perfection is theoretical. The ink, made from soot and gum, stained fingers and sleeves, leaving its mark both on the manuscript and its scribe. The hum of these activities was broken only by the occasional sound of a debate growing animated, a sign that theory was making contact, however briefly, with conviction. Alongside Plato, other figures moved through the academy's orbit. Aristotle, perhaps the most famous of Plato's students, attended these gatherings with a sharp eye for detail and a persistent tendency to question assumptions. Where Plato trusted in the existence of transcendent forms, Aristotle would develop an interest in the world as it presented itself, preferring observation and categorization over pure abstraction. Their disagreements, though polite, were frequent enough to suggest that proximity to Plato was no guarantee of intellectual agreement. In fact, the Academy's most celebrated export was not uniformity, but an enduring tradition of productive dissent. Athens itself was a city in which intellectual life was both celebrated and suspect. The Academy benefited from a relative freedom of thought, though it was never entirely free from public scrutiny. Philosophers, despite their attempts to cultivate detachment, could not ignore the realities of patronage or the shifting tides of civic opinion. The Academy survived, in part because it maintained a cautious balance between radical inquiry and social conformity. If the pursuit of higher truths occasionally strayed into the realms of heresy or impiety, so much the better for attracting the attention of future generations. Material details of scholarly life were never far from the surface. The scrolls, with their carefully inked Greek script, were stored in wooden chests or on rough shelves. Oil lamps provided an uneven golden light as students read late into the evening, their discussions punctuated by the sound of amphorae being set down or the faint echo of footsteps in the corridors. The air was tinged with the scent of pressed olives and lamp oil, and the dust raised by sandals settled on freshly copied texts. Long hours of study might be interrupted by visits from former students, now minor officials or rhetoricians, who returned to debate points of doctrine, or simply to remember a time when certainty seemed within reach. The intellectual atmosphere was marked by a curious tension. On one hand, Plato's insistence on the reality of the forms encouraged an attitude of lofty abstraction. On the other, the necessity of teaching, debating, and writing required ongoing engagement with the ordinary world. It was not unusual for a day's argument about the immortality of the soul to be followed by practical concerns, where to obtain more papyrus, or which student had misplaced a particularly valuable scroll. The search for truth, elevated though it was in theory, remained firmly anchored in the material concerns of a modestly funded institution. As decades passed, and as students came and went, the academy built a reputation for rigor and seriousness, at least by Athenian standards, which allowed for remarkably lively disagreement under the guise of discipline. The philosophical dialogues, initiated there, echoed outward, copied and read by those in other cities, sometimes even beyond the Greek world. Yet the arguments remained, on the whole, open-ended, even as students prepared to move on to other schools, to political life, or to positions of teaching elsewhere. They carried with them the habits of questioning, debate, and close reading that defined the academy. The unending nature of these discussions was perhaps the greatest tradition of all, ensuring that the philosophical work, begun in Plato's shade-bound courtyard, would continue, unresolved but undiminished, long after the olive trees had grown old. The persistent hum of philosophical life at the academy carried on through successive generations, each inheriting not only the physical structures but the peculiar intellectual habits that Plato had set in motion. Scholars rose with the sun, their sandals brushing against tiled floors as they assembled beneath the olive trees or within shaded colonnades. The morning air was cool, sometimes tinged with the scent of damp earth, and the only sound that rivaled the measured cadence of recited Greek was the occasional caw of a bird from the nearby groves. These were the hours dedicated to what was termed dialectic, a word that in practice meant a good deal of patient listening, careful argument, and the steady exchange of doubts. This culture of questioning did not arise by accident. Plato's dialogues, now familiar to students across the city, and increasingly, the broader Hellenic world, provided the framework for intellectual life. The Republic, with its portrait of the ideal city and its famous cave, became a central reference. Yet it was accompanied by other texts, the Phaedo and its speculations on the soul, the Symposium and its strangely methodical approach to love, and the Timaeus, in which the cosmos itself was subject to the same rigorous debate as the correct method of sharpening a reed pen. The reading of these works was almost ritualistic. A student might spend a morning tracing a single argument over many pages, pausing to mark a perplexing passage or note a turn of phrase that seemed especially slippery. The margins of these scrolls bore traces of generations, some in faded ink, others in the cramped script of a more recent copyist, all seeking clarity from lines that rarely yielded it willingly. The physical environment of the academy was as much a participant in this ongoing enterprise as the students or teachers. Scrolls were kept in wooden chests or stacked on simple shelves, each labeled in a manner that was more optimistic than precise. Oil lamps illuminated the worn surfaces of tables in the evening, and the slight tang of burning wick mingled with the dust that settled on every exposed surface. When rain fell, the sound against tiled roofs provided a subdued counterpoint to the murmured repetition of arguments. On clear afternoons, the debates would spill into the open, with groups gathering in the dappled light to rehearse an argument, sometimes simply to practice the art of sounding decisive. The academy was not isolated from the wider world, despite its air of otherworldly contemplation. Ambitious young men, from as far as Syracuse and Thebes, sought entry, bringing with them local perspectives and regional quarrels. Teachers adapted their curricula to the interests and backgrounds of these students, though the central dogmas, if Plato's works could be called dogmatic, remained unchanged. New questions arose as the social and political realities of the Hellenic world shifted. The rise of Macedon and the decline of city-state independence left their mark on philosophical speculation. Political theory took on an urgent tone, and reflections on justice or the role of the philosopher in the city gained new relevance. There was a quiet irony in the fact that while the academy discussed the best kind of ruler in the abstract, real rulers rarely seemed to consult philosophers except in ceremonial capacities. Among the evolving cast of scholars, certain figures shaped the daily tone of inquiry. Spalsip, Plato's nephew, stepped into a leadership role after his uncle's death, attempting to refine and expand the curriculum. Xenocrates, methodical and reserved, insisted on the moral seriousness of philosophy. Later, Polemo's influence shifted the academy's emphasis toward practical ethics, breaking the monotony of pure abstraction with discussions rooted in the conduct of life. The reputation of the academy grew, partially because it represented continuity in a world of shifting alliances and public fortunes, and partially because it produced students skilled in rhetoric and disputation, qualifications appreciated in any era. The practice of copying and commenting on texts became increasingly collaborative. Junior students were assigned passages to transcribe, their work scrutinized by those more experienced. The errors and variations that crept into the manuscripts provided both a practical exercise and an object lesson in the elusiveness of certainty. The more they copied, the more apparent it became that words, like ideas, were vulnerable to the pressures of time, fatigue, and interpretation. This did little to discourage the pursuit of clarity. If anything, it added a subtle pleasure, the knowledge that each correction, each marginal note, was a small act of resistance against the inevitable decay of reason. In these practices, the academy established a pattern that would echo in later centuries, questioning as a lifestyle, debate as a daily rhythm, and the deliberate search for principles that seemed, with each generation, just out of reach. Even as the olive trees thickened and the city's political fortunes shifted, the essential character of the place endured. The pursuit of knowledge, however imperfect, was deemed worth the effort, and was regarded by those within the stone walls as the highest calling. Time, ink, and patience were the chief currencies. An intellectual community was measured not by agreement, but by the willingness to persist in asking one more question. Through the changing generations of the academy, the gentle persistence of philosophical routine mingled with the slow evolution of ideas. No single doctrine could claim permanent victory, and this resistance to final answers became a quiet hallmark of the school. The practice of dialectic, at first painstakingly modeled on Plato's own dialogues, gradually diversified as scholars tried to accommodate new problems or reinterpret the old ones. The process remained disciplined, anchored by the customs of respectful address and turn-taking. Yet, disagreements were expected and even quietly valued. The only real heresy was to accept a conclusion without examining its foundation. The rhythm of study was marked by a tension between tradition and innovation. Students began their philosophical careers by memorizing passages from Plato, but even the most dutiful could not avoid the temptation to ask whether their master's assertions about the forms or the soul could withstand fresh scrutiny. Margins of scrolls became crowded with questions, cross-references, and the occasional pointed remark that betrayed a student's skepticism. In midday light, scrolls were unrolled and read again, their text faded by time and use, while the scent of oil and parchment drifted in from neighboring storerooms. New interpretations circulated alongside the authoritative texts, and instructors alternated between defending established views and indulging in cautious speculation. The physical setting remained as modest and enduring as the school's intellectual ambitions. Sun faded the painted lintels of the academy's entryways. Pebbled paths wound between sparse plantings, leading to low stone walls where students gathered in small groups. In the lecture halls, morning discussions sometimes stretched into the early afternoon, the air growing still and warm. The sound of styluses on wax tablets provided a steady counterpoint to the measured flow of spoken argument. Shelves held precious scrolls with variable reliability, and from time to time an apprentice was dispatched on a fruitless search for a missing manuscript, only to find it in the most predictable location, under a discarded tunic or beside a nearly empty wine jug. The intellectual community included more than the direct descendants of Plato's thought. Visitors from the Lyceum, founded by Aristotle, would occasionally arrive, bringing with them a confident insistence on empirical observation and more thorough catalogues of natural phenomena. The polite exchanges that followed were rarely conclusive, but they reinforced the notion that philosophical inquiry was a matter of method rather than dogma. Aristotle's own tendency to dissect arguments into finer and finer categories fascinated some and exhausted others, but it established a tradition of systematic analysis that would shape future scholarship across the Mediterranean world. During festivals or periods of civic rest, the Academy's scholars sometimes found themselves engaging with public audiences. Orations on the nature of virtue or justice were delivered in city squares, the speakers adapting their themes to the restless energy of a wider public. Debates spilled beyond the boundaries of the grove, first into the neighboring gymnasium, then into the homes of patrons, eager to be associated with the intellectual vanguard of Athens. Philosophy was never quite a private pursuit, nor was it ever fully at home in the public square. The tension between seclusion and engagement ran through every discussion, influencing the rhythm of daily life as much as the content of debate. Copyists, meanwhile, continued their steady labor. The copying of dialogues and treatises was now sometimes interrupted by the task of glossing or compiling commentaries. This practice added layers to the manuscripts, turning each scroll into a kind of miniature archive of arguments. Scribes developed their own subtle conventions. A marginal star or a neatly drawn triangle marked a particularly controversial passage, while disagreements about a phrase's meaning were sometimes noted in cramped, nearly illegible script at the bottom of the page. Ink stains on robes and tables told the story of concentration and distraction in equal measure. Over time, the Academy's deliberations absorbed influences from outside the traditional canon, as Alexander's empire brought fresh contact with distant lands. New questions emerged about the universality or particularity of philosophical claims. Some students arrived speaking Greek only with difficulty, yet found themselves debating the ideal city or the nature of reality with unlikely fluency. The philosophical identity of the Academy was thus shaped as much by adaptation as by fidelity, a rare case of intellectual tradition surviving by inviting disagreement. The setting, with its mixture of order and gentle disarray, mirrored the state of philosophical inquiry itself. Shadows drifted across stone floors as the day wore on, and the quiet hum of conversation lingered into the evening. Manuscripts awaited their next reader, arguments awaited their next revision, and the olive trees provided the only real sense of continuity. Knowledge remained provisional, but the search for it, repeated day after day in the same familiar spaces, gave the community its peculiar confidence. In such an environment, even skepticism could be considered a form of loyalty. The Academy endured, not by settling questions, but by refusing to let them disappear. As the traditions of the Academy deepened, the boundaries between old and new began to blur. The central texts, handwritten and laboriously recopied, accumulated layers of annotation that sometimes rivaled the original arguments for density and complexity. It was not uncommon to find that a single statement from Plato had grown a miniature forest of commentary, each generation of students adding their own voices, clarifications, and polite objections. The result was a community in which conversation extended not only across the stone benches and shaded courtyards, but through the margins of manuscripts, passed reverently from hand to hand. The daily routine reflected a kind of disciplined spontaneity. Mornings were often devoted to formal lectures, with a senior scholar or guest leading the exposition of a chosen dialogue. Participants sat in loose semicircles, scrolls open, wax tablets at the ready for notes and restless doodling. The lecturer moved through the text with an attention to detail that bordered on the forensic. Key passages would be read aloud, then dissected line by line, students invited to offer their interpretations or to query the translation of a phrase. The exercise was less about reaching a definitive understanding than about mapping the possible range of meanings and consequences. For those who preferred certainty, the process could be disquieting, yet, for others, It was oddly reassuring to find that disagreement was not a sign of failure, but proof that the questions remained alive. After the lecture, smaller groups gathered under the olive trees or along the low walls that marked the academy's perimeter. Here the tone shifted from formality to something approaching conversation. Debates emerged over points of logic or alternative readings of the same dialogue. Students drifted between groups, sometimes trailing a favorite scroll or pausing to watch a more animated dispute. The conversations ranged from the abstract, questions about justice or knowledge, to the practical, such as whether a philosopher should participate in the city's affairs or avoid the distractions of public life. The lines between philosophical speculation and ordinary gossip were sometimes thin, but the ritual of questioning remained intact. Copying manuscripts continued as a constant undercurrent. Skilled scribes and novices alike leaned over rough tables, scratching out letters in a stoic battle against fatigue and the uneven flow of ink. Over time, the Academy's collection became something of a minor archive, its shelves home to not only the works of Plato, but the commentaries and treatises produced by generations of teachers and visitors. Slight variations in handwriting, the accidental smudge, or the odd insertion of personal opinion offered small reminders that even philosophy's pursuit of the universal was always filtered through particular hands. Intellectual life did not entirely exclude the world beyond the academy. The city of Athens, with its shifting fortunes and recurring conflicts, provided both backdrop and occasion for philosophical reflection. Political change, the arrival of foreign students, and the slow dissemination of new ideas all made their mark. Some instructors worried that the growth of the academy brought with it the dangers of dilution, as students arrived with more interest in disputation than discipline. Others welcomed the diversity, noting with some satisfaction that even those least inclined to obedience often left with a heightened respect for the ambiguities of truth. A number of notable figures shaped and reshaped the school's character. Arcesilaus, in the 3rd century BCE, turned the academy toward a more skeptical direction, doubting not only the possibility of certain knowledge, but the reliability of any claim to authority. The practice of arguing both sides of a question became institutionalized, and students learned the value of suspending judgment in the face of strong but competing reasons. Later, Carneades would refine and extend this skepticism, famously arguing in public for and against justice on alternate days, an approach that made clarity seem even less attainable, though it kept the lecture halls full. Through these developments, the academy preserved its basic rhythm while adjusting its intellectual posture to the times. The physical setting retained its stubborn familiarity. Oil lamps flickered as evening fell, casting uneven light on half-finished notes and faces intent on one last argument before the night. The scent of pressed olives and the faint tang of old papyrus filled the air. Scrolls waited on upper shelves, their curled edges bearing traces of many hands and many seasons. The academy's boundaries were marked by nothing more substantial than habit, and the daily return of its students, all drawn by the promise, however faint, of wisdom. The scene was rarely dramatic, but the steady accumulation of debate and commentary created an intellectual architecture as enduring as any stone wall or column. In this environment, philosophy became less a set of answers than a way of moving patiently through doubt. When the academy entered its skeptical phase, daily life, upon its grounds, adjusted in subtle but persistent ways. The confident exposition of fixed truths now shared space with a cultivated hesitation. Philosophers and students learned to voice their claims with a raised eyebrow, and to conclude long arguments with the possibility that both sides might be mistaken. It was a modest transformation, but one that gradually marked the academy as different from other philosophical schools across the Greek world. No one was surprised that the pursuit of certainty could yield only more elaborate uncertainties, though the process remained oddly satisfying for those who participated. Lectures persisted, though their tone was less didactic and more exploratory. Senior instructors might begin with a familiar passage from Plato or Aristotle, only to pause at each critical juncture and invite a collective suspension of judgment. Students, now somewhat more emboldened, grew adept at pointing out ambiguities. Some would raise questions about the very possibility of knowledge, while others refused to be drawn into sweeping conclusions. A single session on the nature of justice could become an exercise in cataloguing the limitations of every definition proposed. The wax tablets, filled with tentative notations, many soon erased or overwritten as arguments shifted. The physical act of erasing an earlier claim came to symbolize, in a quiet and practical way, the cautious intellectual climate that had settled over the school. The copying of manuscripts continued, though the glosses in the margins became more elaborate, often extending into commentary upon commentary. Scribes sometimes annotated not only the content, but the reliability of the source, adding layers of caution to each copy. The shelves now contained scrolls with competing versions of the same dialogue, a gentle acknowledgement that even the act of preservation was subject to debate. The tools of scholarship, ink, papyrus, the flat styluses for tablets, were used just as much to record doubts as to assert conclusions. Meetings and debates occasionally spilled into the city itself. In public squares or colonnaded stos, philosophers from the academy would discuss finer points of epistemology or ethics with citizens, merchants, and visiting foreigners. The skeptical stance proved both disarming and frustrating to audiences who hoped for clear answers. It did, however, reinforce the academy's reputation as a place where even the simplest questions about justice, truth, or piety could unravel into a dozen competing positions. Athenian society, which had always accommodated a measure of philosophical eccentricity, watched these developments with a mixture of bemusement and respect. The willingness to suspend judgment was not always popular, but it earned the academy a reputation for seriousness. Some Athenians preferred their arguments with a sharper edge and a clearer winner, but academy students were content to regard certainty as a local phenomenon, best observed in others. Within the academy's walls, the routines of scholarship remained steady. Library rooms, though modest, expanded to accommodate the growing archive of scrolls, treatises, and commentary. The oil from lamps left faint stains on the wooden tables, where students leaned late into the night, trying to reconcile conflicting arguments, or simply to list the questions that remained unanswered. The sound of sandals and the regular murmur of dialogue marked the slow progress of the day, punctuated by the occasional heated exchange that threatened, but rarely delivered, a final verdict. Figures like Carneades became exemplars of this tradition. Carneades could argue persuasively for a position in the morning, then tear it apart with equal skill in the afternoon. His public debates in Rome and Athens drew large crowds. The spectacle of a philosopher refusing to commit himself to a single doctrine was, to some, a form of entertainment. To others, it was an unsettling reminder that even the most fluent reasoning could be turned against itself. Under Carneades, the academy became known as much for its intellectual agility as for its reverence for established texts. The written works of this period, where they survive, reveal a community at ease with provisional answers and the endless search for stronger objections. Meanwhile, sensory details provided continuity as well as contrast. The crunch of gravel underfoot remained as scholars wandered between the olive trees. The familiar smell of ink and old papyrus, mixed with the sharper tang of pressed olives and the faintly metallic scent of lamp oil, scrolls bearing the handwriting of 4 or 5 generations, sat side by side on uneven shelves. Even as doctrines shifted and debates circled without resolution, the material world of the academy endured. Thus, the skeptical academy thrived on the productive discomfort of not knowing. It offered its students few certainties, but it rewarded them with the kind of intellectual discipline that comes only from resisting easy conclusions. The enduring irony, of course, was that this posture of doubt became its own tradition, so firmly rooted in daily practice and institutional memory that it could be recognized instantly by those who visited, even if they found themselves uncertain about everything else. The skeptical tradition of the academy, so carefully cultivated, eventually became both a hallmark of its distinction and a source of persistent tension with the wider philosophical landscape. Surrounding schools, such as the Stoics and Epicureans, found the academy's refusal to settle on any doctrine alternately baffling and irritating. The Stoics, who prided themselves on identifying clear principles for ethical living, regarded the academy as a kind of intellectual rest stop, an admirable place to refresh, but not a destination for those seeking firm answers. Epicureans, for their part, offered practical advice for escaping pain and maximizing pleasure, only to discover that students of the academy responded with questions about the reliability of sensation. The resulting debates, conducted in the colonnades and shaded courts of Athens, ranged from cordial to exasperated, with the academy's skeptics maintaining that doubt was not simply a tactic, but a form of commitment in its own right. Inside the academy's modest walls, daily practices adapted to this ethos of critical hesitation. The morning seminar often began with the reading of a respected text, perhaps a passage from Plato, or a set of Stoic maxims recently imported from the Stoipoikile. Yet, rather than treating these words as dogma, the gathering would proceed with a methodical examination of every possible objection. A single claim concerning virtue or knowledge might unravel over the course of several hours, as students and instructors alike pressed for clarification, drew distinctions, and raised counterexamples. Wax tablets became crowded with provisional summaries, arrows pointing in several directions, lists of assumptions, and the occasional admission that more information was needed. The process was not swift. If anyone in Athens expected philosophy to provide shortcuts, the academy was content to disappoint. Commentaries multiplied in this skeptical climate. Copies of dialogues and treatises were often attached to new scrolls bearing long lines of analysis, critical glosses, and sometimes even formal refutations. Scribes developed an almost competitive approach to identifying ambiguities, their marginal notes growing more ambitious with every generation. The result was a living archive marked by a kind of intellectual humility, though it might also be described as a highly organized form of indecision. Each contribution to the Academy's collection acknowledged the possibility of future correction. It was a paradox that would not have surprised anyone on the faculty. Outside the lecture halls, the rhythms of scholarly life continued. The clatter of sandals on stone, the steady movement of students between the library and debating courtyards, and the scent of oil from newly filled lamps, all signaled a continuity that no amount of philosophical disagreement could disrupt. The walls, though simple, had acquired layers of meaning through their years of use. Scratched initials and faded commemorations marked the passage of students now long gone, but whose preferences for certain arguments persisted in the scrolls that remained. The social context also shifted as the reach of Hellenic culture extended further. Students arrived from distant cities, their particular dialects and customs, adding new perspectives to the ongoing dialogues. Some brought with them questions shaped by local religious practice or political upheaval. Others arrived, paradoxically, with the hope of finding the kind of certainty that the Academy seemed perpetually to defer. The administration adapted with a kind of pragmatic flexibility. Instruction remained rooted in the Greek language and familiar texts, but seminars occasionally paused to accommodate the needs of a wider, more varied student body. The Academy's willingness to embrace doubt proved useful in welcoming difference, even if it provided little comfort to those who still hoped for final answers. Notable figures continued to shape the institution's method and tone. Philo of Larissa, who led the Academy during its later phase, sought to reconcile its skepticism with the practical demands of life outside the groves. Philo argued that even in the absence of certainty, individuals must act on the basis of what seems most plausible. This approach, known as probabilism, allowed the Academy to maintain its commitment to critical inquiry while acknowledging the necessities of everyday action. It was, in its own way, a philosophical compromise, satisfying to those who valued prudence, but still open to objection from purists who saw any concession as a risk to the discipline's integrity. The sensory details of the academy remained unchanged amid these intellectual adjustments. The same light played across the tiled floors in the afternoon, while the same shadows lengthened as scholars lingered over unfinished debates. The faint aroma of parchment, now mingled with the mustiness of older tomes, marked the library as a place of both promise and limitation. Each day's activities left small traces, ink stains, worn corners of scrolls, and the imprints of many hands on the same smooth stones. Through it all, the Academy's skepticism endured, unhurried, rigorous, and never entirely settled, even as the rest of the philosophical world pressed forward in search of closure. As the skeptical Academy settled into its mature phase, its rhythms of thought and scholarly activity became something of a spectacle for observers both within and outside Athens. The city itself was no longer the unrivaled center of the Greek world, but it retained a stubborn reputation for intellectual idiosyncrasy. Visitors remarked on the peculiarity of a school whose students and masters seemed content to harvest uncertainty with the same regularity that others harvested olives. The Academy's attitude toward knowledge, careful, methodical, and rarely hurried, stood in quiet contrast to the more decisive claims of Stoics or Peripatetics, who sometimes found the skeptical approach both admirable and vaguely exhausting. Within the stone walls, the day began much as it always had, with practical tasks that revealed the enduring requirements of any scholarly community. Lamps were trimmed and lit. Tables were cleared of the previous night's drafts and commentaries. Scrolls were retrieved from the storage chests, their ends tied with thin cords and their surfaces marked by the fingerprints of generations. The first gatherings of the day often featured instructors reading from works both ancient and new. The cadence of Attic Greek mingled with the coughs and shuffles of students settling onto benches. The conversations that followed were rarely linear. A question about virtue might detour through several definitions before returning to the matter at hand, having acquired additional complications along the way. The skeptical tradition encouraged a particular style of engagement. Participants were expected to lay out their arguments step by step, with each premise open to scrutiny. Rather than aiming for quick consensus, students practiced the art of provisional agreement, accepting an idea as plausible for the sake of argument, while reserving the right to withdraw assent should a better objection arise. The academic exercise of epoch, or withholding judgment, became both an intellectual discipline and a social ritual. It was not uncommon for a visiting philosopher, unused to this patient indecision, to mistake it for apathy or indecisiveness. The regulars knew better. Suspended judgment, if properly cultivated, required more effort than affirmation. Scribes and scholars continued their steady labor with the Academy's ever-expanding collection of works. Papyrus remained the primary medium, though the oldest scrolls now showed signs of wear. Edges frayed, ink faded, and the occasional hole threatening to erase a critical passage. Copyists worked to preserve not just the core dialogues, but the web of commentary, dispute, and revision that had attached itself to each text. Sometimes, a single argument would be preserved in several slightly different versions, each reflecting the uncertainties and preferences of the copyist. If this ensured nothing like finality, it did lend the library a peculiar dynamism. To read in the Academy was to see philosophy in motion, never fully at rest. Outside the library, the courtyards and walkways remained the sites of informal debate. The low murmur of discussion was punctuated by the occasional emphatic gesture or the sound of a wax tablet snapping shut in mild frustration. The architecture itself, unchanged for generations, fostered both intimacy and division. A series of small spaces joined by wider corridors, encouraging the circulation of conversation and the circulation of doubts. The shade of the olive trees and the coolness of the stones underfoot provided small comforts for those committed to prolonged contemplation. Athens continued to attract a shifting population of students and teachers, many from beyond the city's original borders. Some came seeking the secrets of Plato's wisdom, only to encounter a method more committed to dismantling than to building. Others found solace in the careful preservation of ambiguity, taking consolation from the notion that to persist in questioning was, in itself, a form of progress. The Academy's reputation for rigor ensured that it remained an intellectual destination, if not always a source of easy inspiration. Figures such as Clitomachus, a student of Carneades, further refined the skeptical method. He compiled extensive surveys of arguments for and against nearly every important philosophical claim, ensuring that the Academy's archive grew ever more labyrinthine. New generations of skeptics explored the boundaries between doubt and practice, asking whether a life governed by uncertainty could nevertheless be a good one. The consensus, if it could be called that, was that one might live well without knowing for certain what living well really meant. The sensory world of the Academy persisted unchanged. The smell of lamp oil in the morning, the rough texture of linen garments against stone benches, the faint rustle of leaves overhead, and the ceaseless hum of conversation all marks the passage of another day devoted to inquiry. In these details, the legacy of the Academy was quietly sustained, not by the triumph of doctrine, but by the enduring discipline of careful thinking, skeptical dialogue, and the willingness to treat each answer as a temporary guest rather than a permanent resident. By the later generations of the Academy, this culture of skepticism had become as institutionalized as its marble columns and olive-shaded walkways. The avoidance of dogma was no longer merely a habit, but an expectation, woven into the mechanics of daily life. Instructors opened dialogues with questions rather than declarations, and students, trained to distrust the surface of every argument, grew skilled in tracing the subtle slopes of bias, assumption, and logical misstep. The act of reading itself became an exercise in vigilance, a slow movement through text and commentary, eyes alert for both hidden premises and opportunities for deeper questioning. The architecture and rhythm of the Academy reinforced this atmosphere of suspended judgment. Each morning, the faint scent of oil lamps mingled with the crispness of the air, as rooms filled gradually with the shuffling of sandals and the rustle of papyrus scrolls being unrolled. Conversation began before the lessons started in earnest, as pairs of students rehearsed the points likely to arise in that day's seminar. The walls, lined with shelves of carefully labeled manuscripts, bore silent witness to the centuries of commentary and correction. The inscriptions and marginalia on the oldest scrolls often formed their own network of discussion, with questions penned in the margins drawing answers, retorts, or simple shrugs from later generations. The library's caretakers, well aware of the fragility of their collection, worked with a mixture of reverence and resignation. Manuscripts were brushed clean and rewrapped with thin cord at the end of each day. The most worn volumes, their edges softened by hundreds of readings, were handled only by senior members. The process of copying remained painstaking. Ink was measured drop by drop, and papyrus sheets were chosen for their even texture and lack of flaws. Each new copy, inevitably containing minor variations, was reviewed, annotated, and sometimes debated as an artifact in its own right. The presence of a correction in a familiar argument could itself trigger a new round of speculation. Lectures and seminars maintained an unhurried pace, drawing students through the stances of past philosophers and the complications of each new objection. The method of argument was not adversarial, but persistent. Students might spend weeks or months circling a single theme, such as the reliability of perception or the nature of definitions. Instructors found that the promise of a final answer was less effective than the steady reward of a well-formulated question. Progress was marked by moments of hesitation rather than by confident leaps, and the occasional arrival at a plausible conclusion was treated with cautious satisfaction. If answers ever emerged, they did so provisionally, and only after being tested by the full weight of communal scrutiny. Beyond the boundaries of the academy, Athens retained a reputation for contentious dialogue, but fewer citizens now expected philosophy to yield immediate benefits. The city's role as a gathering place for foreign scholars, itinerant teachers, and ambitious students from across the eastern Mediterranean grew more pronounced. The skeptical academy, with its distinctive blend of rigor and reserve, drew visitors curious to witness its practices. Some found the atmosphere bracing, an antidote to the more prescriptive styles of other schools. Others left unconvinced, quietly preferring the reassurance of systems that promised a firmer grasp on truth. Notable leaders continued to guide the skeptical approach. The writings of Philo of Larissa, for example, circulated well beyond Athens, influencing thinkers from Alexandria to Rome. His careful distinction between what is plausible and what is certain provided a kind of philosophical safety rail for those who found habitual doubt disorienting. Under his guidance, the academy maintained its skepticism while quietly acknowledging the demands of ordinary life, in which action could hardly wait for absolute certainty. In this way, the school managed the contradiction of promoting doubt while preparing students for the practical affairs of civic or private business. Material details sustained the feeling of continuity. The press of sandals on stone, the low murmur of debate leaking into corridors, and the scratch of reeds on papyrus created a familiar backdrop. The taste of simple bread and olives, sometimes a midday meal shared in the shade, reminded participants that even the most rigorous skepticism had to bow to necessity. The cycle of reading, questioning, writing, and rewriting was rarely interrupted, for it was this very rhythm that made the academy recognizable, regardless of the prevailing winds of political fortune or philosophical fashion. What endured was not the certainty of doctrine, but the daily discipline of careful thought and the subtle satisfaction of a question left open just a little longer. By the final phase of the skeptical academy, its internal climate had reached a state of settled ambivalence, an achievement that would have confounded those suspicious of philosophy's tendency to question itself into oblivion. Yet among its students and scholars, this persistent refusal to resolve matters was considered both a discipline and a tradition in its own right. The daily routine still opened with rituals now centuries old, the lighting of lamps, the gentle removal of dust from scrolls, and the careful arrangement of seats for yet another day of inquiry. The tranquility of the setting, a blend of pale morning light, quiet footfalls, and the faint aroma of olive oil, stood in marked contrast to the ceaseless movement of debate within its walls. Seminars proceeded with a familiar rhythm, a respected figure, sometimes a head of the academy, other times a senior student, began with a reading from a canonical text. This would often be a passage from one of Plato's dialogues, or perhaps a selection from a more recent commentator, such as Clitomachus. What followed was less an exposition than a forensic examination. Each claim or definition was treated as a specimen to be turned over and observed from every angle. The notion that even the clearest phrase might conceal ambiguity was not regarded as a failing, but as proof that philosophical vigilance remained necessary. Margins filled with new notes and queries. Sometimes an entire morning was devoted to the precise meaning of a single word, a practice which, for those outside the academy, appeared more like a ritual of delay than a pursuit of wisdom. In the spaces between formal meetings, smaller groups convened under the arcade or among the olive trees. Here, the atmosphere loosened, though the topic rarely strayed far from the morning's inquiry. Arguments grew more conversational, with students describing their own confusions or proposing objections that had occurred to them in the night. The sharing of provisional insights became a social expectation. If disagreement proved inevitable, it was handled with the polite resignation of those who understood that consensus would be neither rapid nor lasting. The culture of the academy allowed for friendships tested, and sometimes sustained, by ongoing difference. The process of manuscript production and commentary continued to reflect the school's skeptical method. Scribes worked in pairs to check each other's copies, a practice that slowed the work but minimized the persistence of undetected errors. Annotations multiplied along the borders of each sheet. Occasionally, a frustrated scribe would insert a dry remark about the practicality of endless revision, as though reminding future readers that skepticism, while intellectually stimulating, could be physically taxing. In the cool, shaded library, the faint scent of ink, the texture of papyrus, and the creak of the wooden shelves provided a tactile counterpoint to the abstraction of the ideas being copied. Beyond the discipline of study, the skeptical academy left its mark on the intellectual and civic life of Athens. Some of its graduates entered public service, bringing with them a habit of careful reasoning that could occasionally slow even the most urgent assembly. Others became teachers, exporting skepticism as a virtue to smaller schools throughout the Greek-speaking world. The city itself, watching these developments, maintained a mixture of pride and amusement. The Athenian reputation for restless argumentation was only strengthened by the sight of philosophers treating even the simplest topics as candidates for indefinite inquiry. Among the notable figures of this era, Philo of Larissa's influence persisted, as did his cautious idea that action in the absence of certainty required the best available evidence. The Academy never produced a formal creed, but it did generate an extensive catalogue of possible objections to every creed proposed elsewhere. This output, serious in intent, but often dryly self-aware, became part of the school's legacy. Later philosophers, including some who opposed skepticism, found themselves compelled to address arguments first forged beneath the olive trees of the Academy. Material details continue to underpin the school's identity. The dull gleam of worn bench seats, the soft clatter of styluses on wax tablets, the intermittent calls of birds from the garden, and the unmistakable feel of linen against skin, all reminded scholars that philosophical labor, while abstract in aim, was always conducted in the midst of the ordinary. Through this unyielding attention to method and the subtle camaraderie it fostered, the skeptical academy managed to transform doubt into an enduring intellectual practice. The search for certainty, rather than ending in disappointment, found new meaning in the community's willingness to question, to record, and to leave open every conclusion. The air of gentle dissatisfaction with answers was, by the end, a source of stability rather than anxiety, one last irony in a tradition that had grown comfortable with contradiction.